Well, good morning, Manna Church. Jeff Christensen here, and welcome to part 2 of Love and the Law of God for Morning Manna. This week, we're talking about how we as Christians are called to live out the love of God and our need to sort of do away with some of the cultural ambiguity as to what love is. In Romans 13, the Apostle Paul sheds some much needed light on this subject for us. And he kind of brings us or enables us to come to this working definition of biblical love as the orientation of the heart that genuinely desires, promotes, and works toward the flourishing of others. So in this passage, Romans 13, Paul gives us 2 ways in which we're called to walk out this love. And the first, which we'll talk about today, is how we live our lives to promote order and peace in society, in the community around us. So in verses 1 through 6 of Romans 13, Paul teaches how God's people are called to live in peace with governing authorities. And he's clearly saying here that we're supposed to do that. Now, there's a lot in these verses, and they could probably be a series of messages just in themselves. I want to focus on verse 7. Verse 7 in Romans 13 tells us, "Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed." Now, you might be thinking, Jeff, this verse doesn't mention anything about love. And verses 1 through 6 in this chapter, they don't use the word love either, and you'd be right. The word love isn't used in these verses. But remember that verses 1 through 14 in Romans 13 are all part of the same pericope, the same thought and theme. And in truth, a lot of scholars would say that the pericope here actually begins back with verse 9 of the previous chapter, chapter 12. In those verses, Paul actually includes showing honor as a characteristic of genuine love. So it really goes without saying that in chapter 13, verses 1 through 14 are all part of the same pericope, the same thought and theme. Now, notice in 13, verse 7, that Paul says we're called to fulfill these societal obligations to civil authorities, and to have a good standing in the marketplace. Now, sometimes paying taxes and paying debts, these feel like drudgeries, right? But Paul is basically saying honor authority and pay your debts. Be financially responsible people. Well, why does that matter? Well, because these things actually promote the flourishing of the community, the people around us. They help support order and peace. These things actually benefit other people. They're part of loving our community well, and therefore loving other people well. Okay, now I said I wanted to focus on verse 7, but I gotta mention verse 8. Paul in verse 8 starts by saying, "Owe no one anything." And this needs some explaining. He's not saying that we shouldn't pay taxes or that payment plans are always evil or anything. He's not saying you don't owe anyone anything. He's not saying that at all. In fact, this verse is actually connected back to verse 7, the previous verse, and is saying pay what is owed. And it actually means to be committed financially, to be responsible financially. It's this idea of basically be paying what's owed so that you reach the point of owing nothing. He means we should live lives that prioritize paying off what we owe, being trustworthy, being people of character. Let's be committed to loving our community well. Let me share one last passage with you. We find this in Jeremiah chapter 29, starting with verse 4. He says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease, but seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare." Good to be with you today, Manna Church. Come back tomorrow for part 3 of Love and the Law of God for Morning Manna.